from reconciliation in FY27, but now they've actually got protein built in. They've got some endurance here, and the meal that they're trying to bite off of the budget. So that is one of the welcome surprises. This is an enduring increase that is planned in the budget, not a one-off.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. A few weeks ago, the White House formally showed its intent to dramatically grow the annual defense budget. The top line for the Pentagon? $1.5 trillion for 2027. This week, it was the turn of the Department of Defense to reveal and defend just what it wants to spend that taxpayer money on. While at the same time of this recording, most of the Space Force budget documents had not been released. It is nevertheless clear the administration wants to spend bigly on space power. The numbers are extraordinary. The total Department of Defense budget request comes in at $1.5 trillion, a $441 billion or 44% increase over the FY 2026 enacted level. The Space Force, which accounts for roughly 4.7% of that total request, could see its budget grow by 124%, from $31.6 billion in FY 2026 to $71.1 billion in FY 2027. That is, if Congress agrees with the administration's plans. In human terms, the Space Force today has 10,400 active duty Guardians. The budget proposes growing that to 13,200, but the amount that could be spent on Guardian salaries represents just a drop in this budget bucket. Just $1.81 billion for military personnel. Compare that to the $17.3 billion for a single classified research and development line, and another budget line, $5 billion for missile warning and tracking. To read these tea leaves, to discern whether this is strategic, whether this is sustainable, and does this have a chance of surviving congressional scrutiny, we have Todd Harrison and Sam Wilson. But before we get to our discussion on the budget, I want to mark a few developments in the Golden Dome for America program that occurred after we recorded. Yesterday, April 23rd, according to a DoD press release, Space Force General Mike Gutlein, the director of the program, said that the program is, quote, ahead of schedule and on budget, end quote. He also confirmed that an initial architecture blueprint is complete, that a command and control consortium has been established, and that contracts have been awarded. And today, in another press release, Space Force Space Systems Command confirmed that in late 2025 and earlier this year, it awarded 20 other transaction authority agreements with a potential combined value of $3.2 billion. The awards were given to 12 companies. Their task? To develop a space-based interceptor system capable of destroying modern missile threats. According to the press release, the Space Force will demonstrate an initial capability in 2028. And just for everyone's edification, the companies named include Anduril, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, True Anomaly, and Turian Space, among others. Now here's my conversation with Todd and Sam. Hey there, Todd. Sam, thank you both for joining me this week. It's great to have you both back on the podcast.
Always a pleasure.
It's budget season. I'd love it if you guys could take a moment to show our listeners why I can't get after this subject without your help. So please briefly introduce yourselves. And Todd, you are at the American Enterprise Institute, and you are my much loved and appreciated budget Yoda. You should go first.
Sure. Yeah. Todd Harrison, Senior Fellow at AEI. My research areas cover the defense budget, space policy, space security, those kind of things.
And he's a super nerd. I found out he's like got
epic nerd.
Epic. like
a badge of
engineering
pride.
and space. It should
That's right.
be. And Sam, you are my favorite number cruncher on the West Coast. Tell us a little bit about what you do at the Aerospace Corporation.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So I am in the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, which is our policy think tank within the Aerospace Corporation, and I lead our strategy and national security team. And among
Again,
other things, I always write our budget brief.
which is required reading for all those who want to dig into this, including me. So, hey, this week we were promised the justification books, which are called J books for short. And at the time of this recording, the Department of the Air Force Financial Management Comptroller managed to release some budget documents related to the Department of the Air Force and the Air Force, but there's nothing really on the Space Force. And I'm just going to say it plainly here, that's super lame. And it just throws what I hope is a temporary wool blanket over this year's budget rollout. I'm saying this because in years past, all the budget J books from the Department of the Air Force were released in a relatively timely manner. And also in years past, the Department of the Air Force's comptroller press conference was live streamed. Anyone could watch and listen to the DoD officials defend the administration's spending plan. This year, when the administration wants to grow the Space Force budget by 124% from around $31.5 billion to just more than $71 billion, there was allegedly a press opportunity, but no live stream. We had that in years past, and not having one this time is also super lame. I imagine there were congressional staffers, lobbyists, commercial space business development folks who also wanted to watch, and yes, likely adversaries as well. But I will say from the main DoD budget briefing, which was live streamed, the acting DoD comptroller, Jules Hurst, really emphasized investment in space systems and technologies right at the top, which I'd like to think means that space is really a top priority. Like this administration seems to actually get that space is important. So Sam and Todd, you too. But first, Sam, what is the headline for space and defense in this 2027 presidential budget request for the DoD? Sam?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I mean, I think the headline, there's a lot of interesting stories and narratives with this budget request, but I think the headline from a space perspective has to be the top line, right? Dramatic growth. Last year for FY26, for fiscal year 2026, based on the current spend plan and then what was released in the budget documents, that was for $32 billion that we saw for the Space Force. This year, from the budget request plus the reconciliation, 71.5. So dramatic top line growth. I remember hearing then Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall a couple of years ago say, hey, if the Space Force is actually going to realize some of the missions that it wants to do and some of the capabilities that it wants to pursue, its budget is going to have to double or triple. And that didn't seem likely at the time, but now we've seen it in a couple of years, at least based on this request. Now, again, I think I'd be really interested to hear from Todd about what he predicts is going to happen. But based on this request, huge top line growth with, again, a lot of interesting narratives underneath.
So Todd, what's your headline?
Yeah, no, I think my headline, also is about the top line, but I'll go a little further. I think this is an all-in budget when it comes to space. They are all in on funding pretty much everything they could possibly fund to the maximum extent. And the surprising thing to me is not just that we see the Space Force budget basically double, get up to 71 billion, a little over 71 billion. Part of that's due to reconciliation. What's surprising is in the out years is it stays at that elevated level, even though reconciliation goes away. So for FY28, it's about 70 billion. And then by FY31, it settles down to about 66 billion. So this is not, like I said last year, I think at this time on your show, I said reconciliation was this one-time sugar high for the Space Force. They had no plan on how to continue that in the future. There's a little bit of sugar high from reconciliation in FY27, but now they've actually got protein built in. They've got some endurance here, and that the meal that they're trying to bite off of the budget. So that is one of the welcome surprises. Is this is an enduring increase that is planned in the budget, not a one-off.
So this is protein. Protein is the headline.
Protein.
Laura, can I just riff off what Todd said? I think was so interesting. Todd called this a one-time sugar high last year when we all spoke together, and then I probably heard 25 people after that refer to this as that, and I was like, "Wow, Todd really should have trademarked this." I mean, it got huge traction. Just one note on what Todd said.
Todd should trademark, the protein budget. Instead of a protein bar, it's the protein budget.
Yeah, this budget's like a protein shake. It's got peanut butter and everything in it.
Well, but hang on a second. As we don't have the J books at the time of this recording, which I might add, right? The Space Force only accounts for 4.75% of that total $1.5 trillion DoD request, that top line number. What budget line connected to a mission set are you most interested in seeing that you can't see in what has been released so far? Todd?
Ooh, I'm going to say I want to see the out-year projections for the Airborne Moving Target Indication funding line. It's a procurement line that's like around $7 billion in procurement, which suggests like they're actually ready to get started on this thing. There was some other money for this mission in last year's reconciliation, so they already had money to get started. Now they're putting in $7 billion for procurement in 1 year, which is huge, even for space programs. I want to see what other money is in the fight up for that.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think the moving target indication programs generally would be really interesting to see, because the only budget line that we've seen in the J books for the moving target indication lines, because last year we saw a bunch of new lines due to reconciliation. Because they were part of reconciliation, we actually didn't see some of the full descriptions, was long range kill chains. That was introduced in 2024. That was the Space Force announcing this space-based moving target indication program. But now we have a bunch of lines, a ton of money dedicated to this mission, but we still I would like to see some of the qualitative, not just the quantitative, with respect to those budget lines. I also think the missile warning and missile tracking area, which I would say includes this moving target indication, but dramatic growth, right? Like this year, if we include moving target indication, over 18 billion. It was just a few years ago. It was like FY22, where this was a mission that was 3 billion consistently. And then now we're seeing over 18 billion. So just dramatic growth. So really interested in that. The last one I'll say is command and control. Then we saw some new budget lines for command and control introduced in this year's request. And I'd like to see some of the details about what those will entail.
All right. Now, before we dig into the budget even more, this next question is about budget and legislation mechanics, right? Because this budget is broken into two legislative parts. And we really can't expect everyone out there to have a degree in congressional appropriations bills. So let's do everyone a favor here. Sam, can you explain the core difference between passing a regular budget bill, one that would fund the Department of Defense or any other department and agency, really, and a reconciliation bill? Because the mechanics are different. The bars that have to be met in terms of votes, I think, have to be different. But I'd really like you to explain that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I had to spend some serious amount of time in the budget brief last year explaining, because the reconciliation part was so tied to what the Space Force was trying to do from a budget perspective. So you have, you really have two completely different legislative processes, right? We have the appropriations process where you have the administration submit a request, and then you have the appropriations committees. And you'll have then the Senate and Congress pass a bill, which will require 60 Senate votes.
And they need hearings too, right?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
But you'll have the appropriators, write their own version of the bill. And again, at the end, you're going to need for appropriations 60 votes in the Senate. For reconciliation, after you pass a budget resolution, which they passed last year, then you only need a majority in the Senate and the House to pass reconciliation. And in contrast with the appropriations, which was mostly for 1 year, right, or for the remainder of that fiscal year, depending on when it gets passed. Reconciliation, last year we saw a lot of the reconciliation measures from FY25 through FY29, so more flexibility on when those funds are spent. One thing I would just note is that last year it was such a big part of the story when we were talking, because the Space Force had proposed $13.8 billion that it was going to spend in FY26 on reconciliation. We can see now with the FY26 spend plan that amount is less. This year for FY26 is about 5.9 for reconciliation. And then for FY27, 12.1. So for last year, this was about 18% of the budget, 18% of the Space Force top line. And then this year, 17%. So not, again, we're seeing something now consistency for how much reconciliation might comprise of the Space Force budget from last year to this year.
So Todd, why is this budget being broken up into a regular budget and a reconciliation bill? Is this some sort of end run around normal budget process? And I'm asking that because this is the second time in a row, and this is weird.
It is, and it's a way of Republicans trying to get an increase in defense spending without having to compromise with Democrats, because they know the compromise would mean dollar for dollar increases in non-defense spending. So this is a way of doing a defense only increase without doubling the cost, if you will.
The political cost.
Yeah, well, and the financial cost in the budget. And so that's why they're trying to do it. And it all comes down to reconciliation only requires a simple majority in the Senate. So, the problem, though, is it also requires a simple majority in the House, and they can only afford to lose one vote with the margins that they have now. So it may not get through. And by the way, the Senate is moving right now on a reconciliation package that does not include any of this. It is just focused on ICE border control funding. And they say that defense would come in a separate reconciliation package, maybe later. So this is all very much up in the air, very uncertain. And, this all, depending on how the midterm elections go, by November, this all may be moot anyway, because you may have one chamber of Congress switching control. So come January, no reconciliation will be possible. So really, they've got a narrow window of time. If they want to get this defense funding into reconciliation, they've got to, realistically, they've got to get this done, signed, on the president's desk before they go out for the August recess. I will add one other difference in the two processes is who writes the actual spending language in the bill. The regular budget goes through the regular appropriations committees, and the appropriators write the appropriations language. Reconciliation goes to the authorizing committees, the armed services committees. So they were like kids in a candy store last year. They actually got to write appropriations for the first time. Normally, they just write an authorization bill that's just policy and it implies spending, but it doesn't actually give you spending. It doesn't give you money to spend. All the budget stuff is in the appropriations bills normally. But with reconciliation, the authorizers will get to choose how that money is allocated. And they are much more willing to give flexibility to the department than the appropriators typically are.
Yeah, because the appropriators have to balance the budget, or at least attempt to, right? We've got some laws on that point. Sam, you were holding up your hand.
I just wanted to ask Todd, what's your prediction for what you think happens here? I mean, again, and thinking about the huge delta, one of the things I think hasn't been discussed is that obviously this is a great news story for the Space Force and defense-based activity, this huge increase, as well as this reconciliation bill. But if we have a CR and if the starting point is last year's appropriations, as usually the starting point is, it's a huge delta for the Space Force, right? Again, thinking 120% from last year's top line to this year's top line, given the uncertainty there, again, as you said, some of the uncertainty with reconciliation, what's your projection?
I right now, I think the odds of reconciliation getting through for defense is basically a coin toss. I think it's very close, and I think it very well may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, then that's a huge problem because you've got a lot of these Space Force programs that are entirely dependent on reconciliation funding, like that airborne moving target indication. All 7 billion of that is in reconciliation. And, another one, the Space Data Network, it's got 1.5 billion in procurement funding. It's all in reconciliation. So they will have to figure out, how do you move that money into the base budget? And by the way, the base budget still requires 60 votes to get through the Senate. And so that's going to require some compromise, because what the Trump administration proposed is also an increase in the base defense budget, but massive cuts in the non-defense side of the budget, including the things that we all like and track, like NASA funding. So yeah, there are huge risks in this budget getting through. So the big caution here is, this looks like a really great budget from like an industry perspective, but do not count your chickens before they have hatched. This is a long way from hatching.
I want to go on that, and I'm going to sort of riff here for a moment, just because you guys went over the fact that Todd spoke about the great sugar high last year. And this year, that sugar high seems to be more like a steep incline up a mountain rather than a cliff, right? So I want to know, from your standpoint, and Todd, you should start this off. I mean, does this really look like a strategy, or does this just look like a plan or a very large bet? And I say that because, there are a lot of big ticket money items, some that we can see, some that we can't, some that are, with Golden Dome. Even at the press conference, the one that they did have, that was for the overall budget. As I said, space was a really big deal. And even in the main DoD press briefing, Space Force Lieutenant General Stephen Whitney, he's the Joint Staff Director of Force Structure, Resources, and Assessment, or the J8. He said that the proposed budget dedicates $75 billion, which is more than the Space Force budget. So it's got Space Force budget stuff in it. But across the whole DoD, $75 billion is being dedicated to space superiority. And that even includes, money for 31 space launches. Is that for next year alone? Or is that like, is this some sort of reconciliation thing? Oh, yeah.
It's huge.
It's huge. 31 space launches, 13 billion for missile warning and tracking capabilities. At least this is what Whitney said. 7.7 billion for, AMTI, 3.1 billion for next generation space data network. And this is what he said in the press conference. And that's directly from the transcript if anyone wants to take a look. But yeah, hey, is this a strategy, or is this something else? Like, we're just sort of betting to get this through.
You can call anything a strategy. I think the real question is, like, how good of a strategy is it? If strategy is about making the hard choices, then no, this doesn't make hard choices because they didn't have to. A budget unconstrained strategy, in my opinion, is not much of a strategy because you don't really need an approach. You don't have to make hard choices if you're budget unconstrained. So they still had the constraints of time and industrial capacity. And in some cases, they may have been waving those away, just assuming we can throw money at the problem and it'll fix itself. But I see this as kind of an all in, all of the above strategy of let's just throw everything in here we can think of, and we'll see what we get.
So I'll add a couple comments. One, I think, Todd, your comments remind me of, I one time heard James Acton say, "There's no three worse words in Washington than budget-driven strategy," which I always think is so funny, because every strategy has got budget in mind, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things you might expect when you saw such a huge increase in the top line is that this is just going to be a general increase for kind of everything, right? For every mission, you're going to see kind of an equal distribution.
This isn't a general increase. This is a general doubling.
Right. But you don't see that in this request. You see the increase really concentrated in a few different mission areas, right? This is not, you're not seeing P&T get a 100% increase. You're seeing missile warning, missile tracking, moving target indication. You're seeing the line that jumped the most is the classified research development testing and evaluation line, which that in itself explains more than a quarter of the total growth from fiscal year 26 to fiscal year 2027. So you're really seeing a few mission areas get huge increases and others get some, but again, it's really not equal. So to me, I would say that there is, even with this huge 120% increase, there is a lot of what you can see what the Space Force is trying to do, rather than we're just going to make a bunch of programs healthy.
Well, Sam, I mean, there's a lot of money in there, and I want to kind of riff off of what you were just saying about what we couldn't see in terms of classified programs and some really important programs that we don't really have a huge amount of eyesight on. And I know, Todd, you're going to have something to say on this because we're going to talk about Golden Dome a little bit. But yeah, the budget documents put the total Golden Dome program cost at $185 billion through 2035. That's not news, but it's receiving less, I believe, this year than it did last year. According to the DoD's overall research, development, test, and evaluation programs budget document for the entire DoD, so it's not broken out. But for 2026, Golden Dome received a little more than $20 billion and for 2027, the administration is asking for $17.5 billion. From what you can see in the public budget lines for FY 2027, how is Golden Dome being treated? It's kind of confusing.
Yeah, well, a couple of notes of caution. So they created a Golden Dome account. It's under the research and development part of the budget. But if you look within that, they say that parts of the account are for R&D, parts are for procurement, and parts are for O&M. And you can tell from what's not in that account, what is being funded separately, that not all things that are Golden Dome related are in the Golden Dome account, right? So Golden Dome, the airborne moving target indication, right? Satellite constellation that the Space Force has in their budget, that will be part of Golden Dome. That will be an important part of Golden Dome. All the missile warning and missile tracking programs in the Space Force budget will be part of Golden Dome. Even the Space Data Network, they're not in that Golden Dome funding line, though. The difference is the Golden Dome account is controlled by OSD. It's in a defense-wide part of the budget. That is what Gutlein controls directly. What he controls indirectly are all the Golden Dome related programs and projects that are funded outside his account, right? So it's Golden Dome is bigger than just that $17.5 billion that you see in the request. That is just what his program office has in their own budget authority.
And Todd, can I ask you something else? I mean, one of the things that was interesting, and this is getting really nerdy, but you saw some of the officials this week use the number for defense space budget over $75 billion. And for me, very clearly 71.5 is what I see with reconciliation in the request. And so I was like, all right, well, how do they get to 75? And then I was looking at the military construction budget for Air Force actually has some funding for Space Force and Space Comm facilities, but you still don't get to 75 or over 75. But in the Golden Dome for America budget line, there is OSD space programs, which is 4.5 billion for FY27. And if you add 4.5 to 71.5, now you're getting close to that 76 number, right? So again, I don't know what it is, but I was just wondering if your take was the same, that maybe that number is being part of what we're hearing from the officials for the top line.
I think that's exactly right. I think they are including the part of the Golden Dome budget that says it's for space programs. They're including that. And so really what they're saying is 75 billion is the total space budget,
right?
But the Space Force budget is still 71. Right. And that just means there's space funding that is going on outside of the Space Force. Reminds me of how things were before space was its own service and everyone thought Air Force Space Command controlled all the space funding. But no, you had the Navy building their own satellite constellations and the Army doing stuff in space. And so, that is happening. But it has led to a lot of like headline confusion. People saying 75, 71. The Space Force's budget is 71. There are different ways of slicing that. Do you include that MILCON? Do you include the non-blue pass-through funding? I think that's like 0.2 billion or so. So you see a few differences within that, but at 71, one way or the other, it rounds. The 75 is if you include the Golden Dome funding. It is not Space Force funding, though.
And just for those congressional staffers out there that may be listening to this, Todd, in terms of Golden Dome very specifically, and maybe in terms of the classified parts of things, and I know that you and your co-authors wrote a piece in March that really dug into the fact that there is no approved spend plan. What do congressional staffers need to advise their principals, right? The legislators on the Hill, what do these legislators really need to ask?
Yeah. Well, right after we wrote that, the spend plan was finalized. So I don't know, correlation, causality. No, I think it was in the works and it had just gotten bogged down, but it finally did go through. So there is a spend plan finally for last year's reconciliation money. It is not as everyone had thought. So as Sam alluded to earlier, the Space Force budget for 26 did not get plussed up over 40 billion like people thought. There was not that much reconciliation funding as originally anticipated. And some of that for Golden Dome, if you look at the Golden Dome account and what are they counting from prior year reconciliation, is actually not that much. Most of that Golden Dome reconciliation funding from last year is being allocated to other programs across the department, which makes a lot of sense. Those are things that are already in progress. That's where the money needs to go if you want to make quick progress. So there is a lot of like unprecedented confusion in how that last year reconciliation funding is going to be counted in the budget. So I would just caution everyone, if you're looking backwards at 26 and 25 funding, be very careful at what you're looking at. TOA versus budget authority are going to be very different. The way DOD counts things and the way OMB counts things could also be very different. So just watch out. If your numbers don't match up, don't pull your hair out. It's by design.
All right. So, Sam, just last week, the Space Force published its Objective Force document, laying out what kind of service it wants to become over the next 15 years. But the orbital warfare and electronic warfare sections are classified. And I have a sneaking suspicion that that is marrying up to the things that you are also finding that are classified and not being talked about. There is a single classified RDT&E line that jumps from 6.5 billion to 17 billion, which you alluded to earlier, and the space control mission, right, goes from 6.7 billion to nearly 18 billion. These are extraordinary numbers. What is the Space Force actually being asked to build?
Well, I can't speculate on the classified side, but I mean, I do think that this is really interesting, Laura. Again, like how focused this is. Again, you have over 180 budget lines for the Space Force, and this growth that we're looking at, this unprecedented growth, a quarter of it is tied into one budget line. I was actually just pulling up my mission areas graphic, and positioning, navigation, timing budget lines from FY25, FY26, FY27, they've gone down with this increase, right? You're seeing the budget go up 120%, but you're seeing position, navigation, timing, an important mission area, actually go down. And that shows how much is concentrated in, again, a few of these mission areas, classified, whatever that comprises, missile warning, as well as launch and some SATCOM capability.
All right. So similar question back to you, Todd. This stuff is classified, and this stuff has big, huge jumps. For these particular mission sets, again, what questions should Congress ask? Because this is American taxpayer money.
Yeah, no, I mean, the folks in Congress do have the clearances. They can go and get read in and see all the details. And I hope they will, because the worst thing that can happen for a program is to not have enough external scrutiny. And that becomes very difficult with classified programs, and even programs where the overall thing is not classified, but parts of it are classified. When it's not subject to broader scrutiny, people who aren't part of making it, that's when programs fall into groupthink. They start overlooking things. It becomes a culture of accepting certain things, risk, assumptions that don't get questioned. And so I really hope that the folks read in on the Hill will heavily scrutinize these programs, ask the hard questions, start picking at all the assumptions behind them so that they can end up being successful in the end. That's why you need that kind of oversight and scrutiny, is to ensure the ultimate mission success. So that does worry me that you're seeing so much go into this part of the budget is classified. The other thing is, a big part of our overall defense strategy in space has been deterrence. We want to deter bad actors in space, and things that you keep secret that your adversary doesn't know exist don't contribute to deterrence. And so at what point, what is their plan when to reveal these capabilities? We've seen talk about this in past, how we're going to do counter space demonstrations and campaigning. Great. I'm all in on that. Haven't seen it. Have not seen it. So when are we going to start to see some of this happening in space? Because if we don't see it, and they've said that we should show these things and we want to deter, that then suggests that it's not working or we don't have it. And that undermines credibility rather than supporting it or reinforcing it.
And Laura, just a quick two fingers here, looking at the fiscal year 2025 classified budget lines, that mission area has tripled from FY25 to FY27, right? From a little less than $7 billion to this year's request to over 21, and then over 20. And last year, again, as Todd mentioned with reconciliation, that reconciliation funding for the Space Force was almost all in the classified mission area. So
it's kind of like, show us the beef, I guess you could say, right? But Todd, let me stay with you here for a moment, because the president's December 2025 executive order directed the Space Force to detect, characterize, and counter threats all the way through cislunar space. This week, we learned the Space Force has just stood up a cislunar acquisition task force, and the Air Force Research Laboratory is preparing to launch its first experimental cislunar monitoring satellite. It may launch sometime next year, right? The executive order also calls for a lunar nuclear reactor ready for launch by 2030 and a permanent lunar outpost by 2030 as well. And that should be human rated. So the NASA budget's been cut, as I know you're really well aware of. It was cut by 23%, at least that's what the request says. When you look at the Space Force FY 2027 budget, is any of this actually funded? I mean, in terms of what the Space Force has been told to do, or is cislunar still a mission that is looking for a budget line?
So I'll say I have not seen the details yet on that. I don't know if Sam has, so I am not sure. But in the cislunar areas, the reality is that NASA is in the lead, and the Space Force at this point will be playing a supporting role. And there are a lot of good things that the Space Force could be doing to help build our national influence and expertise in the cislunar arena, just like the Space Force has built and operates the GPS constellation, which benefits our broader economy. Uh, there are missions in cislunar space that are very similar. Doing, the space domain awareness, understanding who is where, deconflicting. There's no deconfliction right now in lunar orbit, right? There aren't many objects in lunar orbit, but
Yeah.
there's going to come a time where that's going to become important as well. And why not have the Space Force be leading the way to build those capabilities and to perform that function, and then hopefully hand it off to a civil authority later on, just like they should be handing off the conjunction morning in Earth orbit. But there's other parts of it too, timing and navigation around the moon. Why not have the Space Force at the vanguard of building a system like that? Relays for communications to and from the lunar surface, including on the other side of the moon. So I think there are a lot of areas where the Space Force can support. The nuclear reactors, that is essential to building a permanent habitat on the lunar surface. Whether you fund it through the Space Force or directly through NASA or Department of Energy, it doesn't matter to me as long as it's getting done and the work is getting done so we can enable that exploration going forward for the good of the nation, for the good of the economy.
There seems to be a lot of cross-pollinization, though, also with nuclear, right? I mean, it's not just power on the surface of the moon, but it's also maneuver warfare to be able to have nuclear power to actually power your spacecraft to be where it needs to be. So again, it seems like there's been a direction, but I don't see a budget line in there for it. This next question is for the both of you. This budget is being built on a foundation that requires reconciliation work, programs that are largely classified, and a 10-year cost estimate for Golden Dome that no one has fully really explained. You've sort of addressed this. I mean, is this really a sustainable strategy? Is this really a sustainable way to go about funding the Space Force and more generally space power, U.S. space power?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick that up. Well, first of all, the Golden Dome, the 185 billion, I think that's best understood as a cost cap, not a cost estimate, because Gutlein has said that this is what I've been given. This is what I've been given and asked to do. 185 billion, and it's only the acquisition part of it. That also means there's no way he can be building the architecture that was described by the president in the Oval Office. No way on earth. And that's what my analysis has shown. He's got to be building a much, much smaller, more restrained architecture that will in no way end the missile threat to the United States. It will reduce it by some degree, but not the way the president described as nearly 100% effective. So, we know that much now about the Golden Dome architecture is cost constrained. And it is not going to be as big in scope as originally indicated. But in terms of building an ability for these programs to endure, I think they've tried to do that in this budget request, because even though they rely on reconciliation in the first year, they have built these increases into the base budget in the out years. That's what you would need to do to build an enduring program. The risk still, though, is it requires Congress to effectively reset their conception of what the baseline for defense spending should be, to reset it to be somewhere around 1.2 trillion per year, when just a few years ago, we were at 850 billion for defense. So it really requires a big increase in how Congress regards that baseline budget. But if they're willing to do that, then these programs are built in there with, funding throughout the 5-year planning horizon so they could continue.
Yeah, I think that's really well put by Todd. The one thing I'll just add is that we're only seeing I've mentioned this before, we're only seeing 4 new budget lines with this year's request. I think if you have a service where you're having your budget double, there's a temptation to want to add a bunch of new programs, want to add a bunch of new mission areas, right? To want to expand in that way. And again, this will be clearer when we see the J books, but you're not really seeing that with this year's request, right? You're seeing existing programs, existing budget lines just get increases rather than just expanding the parameters of what the Space Force is trying to do. So to me, that's a more sustainable approach than if we saw 40 new budget lines this year, right? That would make me a little bit more concerned. And you saw this from Congress a few years ago where they said, there was concern. I think it was in the NDAA or maybe it was the HAC-D that said, the House Appropriations Committee for Defense, that said, you're starting more programs than you could fund in the long term. And again, this year you're not seeing the introduction of significant new programs based on what we have so far.
All right, we are going to wrap this up, and we're going to do it with a prediction. And Sam, you're going to go up first. When will this? Oh, you can do it. When will this budget be passed? And yeah, I know it's 2 parts, but I didn't build it that way.
Oh my gosh. I'm hopeful that we'll get something, around the end of the annual year. That would be great. I'll just say, for all those cynics, we're ahead of where we were last year, right? Last year we didn't get the dash ones, we didn't get the J books until June. So we're a couple months ahead. So I'm optimistic that we're going to have an appropriations earlier than this year.
Todd, what's your prediction?
I'm a bit more pessimistic. I'll break it up though. I think reconciliation, like I said before, is like a coin toss, but if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in July. So I think July is where I would watch for reconciliation. If it hasn't happened by then, you got to go to plan B. Now, the base budget, I don't think it will be appropriated until maybe like March of next year. I think we'll be halfway through the fiscal year. Yeah.
Wow.
Which, again, from a Space Force planning perspective, right? If that continuing resolution is the 2026 appropriations, that's $26 billion, right? So how do you plan?
And it's further complicated when you write a CR. Do you write it based on the 26 base budget level or 26 plus reconciliation? And is it the reconciliation in the spend plan?
Yeah.
So the CR will be a bit tricky this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting for sure.
Todd, Sam, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.